Yes. Can you hear back there?
Okay. Can you hear me? No?
That's why we're here.
Oh, okay. Wow.
Well, thanks for coming to Chicago, Gary. We appreciate it.
I love this town.
That's good. Glad to hear it.
I love watches and I love Chicago, so when they told me, watches in Chicago, I said, okay.
Well, they said they asked you to come in January, but you said no.
That's true. I'm not stupid.
The fee was twice as much.
Yeah, it was.
To come to Chicago. Well, again, thanks. To me, Gary represents the quintessential American success story. As a small boy, his family emigrated from St. Petersburg, the St. Petersburg that was formerly known as Leningrad,
right.
Not the one that shares an airport with Tampa. So that's where New Yorkers retire to, not emigrate from.
That's where we go to die, yeah.
So then after emigrating here through a series of brilliant maneuvers, successively brilliant maneuvers like studying poli-sci in college and getting a degree in fine arts, Gary has become both the standard track that most ambitious American parents encourage their children to take.
Oh, God.
Gary has become not only a award-winning author, but also a best-selling author. And so now with his newfound wealth and leisure time, he's turned his attention to collection, not art, not cars, not other things, but watches. So with his recent article in The New Yorker and his appearances in the Hodinky, which for those that don't know is a website geared to what Gary has coined the term watch idiot savants or idiot watch savants. I'm not
Watch idiot savants.
Watch idiot savants, thank you. So with those, he has now ascended to the top tier of the cultural icons of watches in America, which is pretty rarefied, if not overly crowded. So welcome again, Gary.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm gonna ask Gary, the first question I'd like to ask you is, I've read a lot of your work and I read Confessions of a Watch Geek, and you told us how ecstatic and happy you were when you were walking out of the Tourneau store in New York and you had just made your first purchase of a fine watch. But what you didn't tell us is, why did you go in the first place? What attracted you to fine watches?
Well, as a novelist, I've always thought, I'm not going to spend money on anything, because you never know when people are going to stop reading you. It can happen anytime. So most smart novelists, or anybody who works in a precarious cultural field, if you make some money, you put it in what in English they call a low-cost index fund, and you let it slowly marinate there for a while. And I've never liked any kind of possessions, ever. I dress very simply. I just go to the nice French store, APC, and they put clothes on me and I leave. I never cared about cars. I just learned to drive a couple of years ago. I bought the safest car I could find on the internet, and I just bought that one. Cameras, I don't really own. Art, none. Damien Hirst gave me one of his pieces for something. That's the only art I have, which is a nice piece.
Nice.
That's a good one. So very, very few possessions. So for me, it was very surprising to fall in love with an object. But when I was a little kid, and I emigrated to America, I didn't speak any English. And all the kids were very tough. It was a very tough yeshiva in Queens, a Hebrew school. You can only imagine.
Is that mutually exclusive or not?
Yeah, no,
yeshivas?
it's kind of, okay. And my only friend was a watch, a Casio watch, a digital watch, that played a Russian song, Kalinka Malinka, boysenberry, oh boysenberry. Sounds better in Russian. And every day I would just listen to the song and it would calm me down. I couldn't speak English or Hebrew, the other language they were using. So the watch was kind of, sad to say, my best friend. So after a while I stopped caring about watches as I got older. But then I went to the MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art in New York, to the design shop to buy some kind of Bauhaus tea kettle or whatever the hell one gets there. And as I was leaving, I saw the watch counter, and they had a watch, a Jung Hans Max Bill. Max Bill was a Swiss designer and artist and sculptor and architect. And he designed this very simple watch for a German company, Jung Hans. And I saw it, and it was the first watch that really appealed to me, because it was neither, in my mind, watches either fall into the Casio, G-Shock kind of giant watch, or a gold, very gold Rolex Day-Date, one of those two variations. So I never knew that there could be something that's different from that. And this was incredibly appealing. So I bought it, and I didn't even know it said automatic on it, and I didn't even know what that meant. I thought all watches ran on the batteries, so to speak. So automatic, for those of you who don't know, means that it's powered by your wrist motion. So as you walk around all day, you know, the watch is charged, so to speak. So when the watch stopped working, I called Junghans, very angry. And I said, what kind of a thing are you selling here? 2 days later, it's dead. The battery's dead. And the very nice German man explained very patiently, yeah, it's from the wrist winding that the power comes from. And so I realized that I knew nothing about watches. And I felt that that was a mistake. So I began to look, of course, on the internet. And quickly I found Hodinkee and other websites. Now, when you're a writer, when you're a novelist, you really only work 3 hours a day or so. And the rest of the time you're drunk, you know. So for me, watches became kind of like the thin membrane between the writing and the getting drunk. And I think it's been helpful. I'm drinking less. Yes.
Well, we surely appreciate that you decided to focus your efforts on discussing watches and your love of watches versus just drinking.
Yeah, no, works out for everyone.
You're famous for your sense of, not famous, but in your writings it comes through, and as you've said, you have a real preference for simplicity and classicism like that. So in a watch, though, what would be the one complication you would be looking for? And let people know what we mean by a complication if you can.
Right. So a time-only watch obviously tells only the time. A complication is anything that is added to that. So for example, a date window is a complication. It can get very convoluted. It can have a perpetual calendar, which is a calendar that can tell time literally forever because it takes into account the leap year. A chronograph is something that's like a stopwatch, basically, that's within a watch. So the only complication I really love, most of the watches I have are very simple. Because I am a very non-complicated, uncomplicated guy. But the one complication I love is the GMT complication, which allows you to tell time in a different time zone. I'm actually wearing one now, a Rolex GMT from the 1960s.
Greenwich Mean Time.
Greenwich Mean Time, yes, of course. So what I love, I have a little kid, he's 4 years old, and I travel a lot. When you're a writer, you're constantly traveling, begging people to please buy a book. Netflix is great, but a book, you know, it's not as good, but it's okay. So whenever I'm in my travels, I always wonder what my kid is up to. And so this way I can look at a watch and I can tell, oh, you know, it's right now it's 8 o'clock in New York. So this is his bedtime. So it was a way for me to stay connected with my kid. And obviously I can also think, well, 7 o'clock plus 1 is 8, right? Since we're only an hour difference between Chicago and New York. But I can't add that well. So for me, this has actually become a really useful feature. So it's the only complication that I truly love.
So you could have bought like a smartwatch for that, or something like that. Why not? What's the attraction to this retro, artistic, mechanical, almost 18th century, if you will, technology in the 21st century?
Yeah. You know, a couple of years ago, people said that the printed book was dead. It was doomed. If people are going to read anything, they were going to read it on a tablet or on a computer, on their phone. But weirdly enough, and I bought into this, I thought, all right, well, people tell me something, it must be true. But the physical book has been bouncing back in the last couple of years. The Kindle's been actually going down, and the Nook, whatever that was, is pretty much gone. Remember the Barnes & Noble Nook? What a name, right? The Nook. Sounds like my Yiddish grandmother.
They didn't call it the schnook. They could have called it that.
That would have been a better word for it. The schnook. But the book has been doing great. And other weird things are coming back. The LP. People are loving the sound of an LP as opposed to a download. So, and weirdly enough, watches, well, it's, the Apple launched its smart watches, but the Swiss watch industry, it goes up and down every once in a while, but I think it's been holding up okay. And that's kind of surprising. And when I go to see other watch geeks, there's an event called the Red Bar, and there's one in Chicago, there's one in most cities. It's a very cute event. All these watch geeks get together, we take off our watch, we put them down on a table, and then we pick up each other's watches and we look at them. It's so sweet. But you often will see a lot of millennials, and I think it is because the world that we live in, whatever object we're talking about, everything is so disposable. I have a new phone, it'll be gone in a year or two, it'll be displaced by something else. But since this is really not any kind of revolutionary technology, and neither is the book, I think they will have a lot longer longevity for people who really care about any kind of preserving any kind of tradition, which is what I think a watch is.
That's great. In your travels, you mentioned how much you travel, Do you see any differences worldwide between watch preferences, what people are looking at? I mean, is it, we deal in the business, so we're dealing worldwide, we're dealing a lot with Swiss watches, and it's more wherever we go in the world, those people know that milieu, if you will, of what we're dealing with. But do you see any differences, cultural differences?
I think in Eastern Europe, the watches get bigger. You know? Russians have a preference for, you'll say, Nardin, Breguet. Pushkin, the poet, actually had a poem about a dandy walking through Nevsky Prospect, the main avenue in St. Petersburg, and looking at his Breguet. You know, the funny thing about watches is that many very unsavory people collect watches. Dictators love watches. And possibly one of the biggest watch collectors around these days is Vladimir Putin, who has millions of dollars worth of watches. So that gives me a little bit of pause.
I didn't see that profile in Hodinky yet, though. Is that
they have this thing called what's that, talking watches. And it's funny to have Putin on talking watches, and then people get shot in the end. And
so then
the interviewer gets shot. Everyone gets sentenced to, you know.
The new movie with Death of the Watch? That was a different
one.
So you're then fairly positive on the future. It's not a dead end of evolution. It's not going to be something we're going to go to museums and look at. You think the millennials are interested? The worldwide interest is there?
I mean, they're beautiful objects. They really are beautiful. Like I said, I've never been interested in anything before, but in any kind of physical object before. But to me, the combination of design, artistry, and engineering is something that's amazing. You look at a watch, for example, Patek Philippe reference 3940, this gorgeous small perpetual calendar that was 9 millimeters thick and yet could do things back in 50 years ago, 40 years ago, things that were, at the forefront of technology in a way and of design. Now, of course, the smartwatch can do anything and everything, but I don't feel happy when I put on anything, when I use any bit of technology, I feel like I'm working. Mm-hmm. When I look at a watch, it doesn't feel like work. And there's something beautifully melancholy about watches that I love. I mean, after all, what is a watch? It's a way of telling us how much time we've spent. It's a way of, clocking our own demise in a way. So if we're going to clock our own demise, we may as well have the most beautiful object we can find to do it.
So you've mentioned the other brands out there. When you wrote your article in the New Yorker, which is about a year ago to the date, you mentioned that you had 4 watches at the time, and I think now you've got 9. So are you getting treatment for this? Are you in treatment, or is it?
I actually have a psychiatrist who is a huge watch nut. So I come to him like, I got to stop. He's like, no, keep going. You're just getting started.
So when he says we're out of time, there's a different meaning to it.
We both look at our watch. I think I still have a minute on mine. I have 9 watches, and I really think I will stop for a while at 10. That's a nice even number.
So what do you aspire to then? What's the 10th one going to be?
Oh, the 10th one is a very simple watch.
Is that the Patek?
No. I bought the sort of more high-end ones I've already bought. And the one I'm wearing today, is one of my favorites. It is a Rolex GMT, but I love watches with some kind of provenance, any kind of history. And this watch was worn by the NASA advisor to the Nixon White House. So in my mind, I like to imagine that it was present during Nixon's drunken rants at midnight. It was like, NASA, space aliens, they're out to get Nixon. But unfortunately, I think the real person they had to deal with was the vice president, Spiro Agnew. I think had sort of NASA under his in his portfolio, and so I read some of this guy's reminiscences about talking to Spiro Agnew, and he was apparently monstrous to deal with. He just kept.
Was that before he went to jail, or after?
Right before jail, and he just kept trying to slash NASA's budget and take away all these programs. So the fact that this watch was privy to all this history makes me love it all the more.
So you think you'll stop at 10? Is there one that jumps out at you that you're looking for? One that you really do aspire to, that you've always wanted?
The watch that I think is the most beautiful watch in the world is a Patek 570 in two-tone. It's in rose gold or yellow gold or steel. I think, and some watch geeks here could probably correct me, I believe they're around $500,000 at this point. I was, yeah, it's, you know, and I keep thinking, does my kid need to go to college, honestly?
Poli-sci and creative writing.
Yeah,
you know?
creative writing, look at me. Right? Although I went to Hunter College in New York, where, you know, it was $800 and you got a free steak. So that's how I saved the money for watches, you know. But that is one of the most beautiful designs ever seen. Very mid-century, 50s, 60s Calatrava, just gorgeous.
Well, Patek will tell you that you don't own it. You're just holding it till the next generation. So it does have some value to it.
Yeah.
So
No, I love Patek. The mid-century Pateks were. I own one that's not anywhere near that kind of price range, but I own it. You take it apart and you look at the movement. So much care was put into that movement. The level of workmanship on such a small object is so intense to see. It's like it's not quite a Fabergé egg, but it's not as gaudy as a Fabergé egg. But it's incredible to think that so many Swiss men and women with real Swiss problems and Swiss dreams and hopes put so much time into developing a watch like that.
So you don't own a smartwatch today, do you?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't. Today I was trying to get on the plane, and this woman had her ticket on the watch. And it took an hour for them to scan it. They kept scanning it, and I was like, get a mechanical watch and print out a ticket. What the hell?
Oh, that's so funny. So if you were going to tell the watch novices in the audience today what they should know about a watch or what they should look at, what would you say? What would be the one thing you'd want a watch novice to take away, and maybe somebody that's more expert in watches?
Well, don't overspend. Know what you're buying it for, in a way. You know, some people do buy a watch for status. I have a friend from Singapore, and he has a really nice Rolex GMT as well. And he says, in Singapore, there's the import duties for cars are so expensive, and there's no place to put your car. So the watch is the only way you can tell other people, hey, I'm okay, you know, I've made it. And so it's perfectly okay to buy it for that. Among serious watch geeks, it's almost like sometimes we buy a watch that nobody will recognize. You know? Because if you really want a status watch, the Rolex Day Date in yellow gold is, I think, the way to go. It's big. I mean, it's not big, but it's...
You mean one like this?
Exactly. It says, hello. And I love those watches. Jack Nicklaus has one. They're, you know, I always think about getting one, maybe in white gold, but, you know, something that because it's just a beautiful piece of design. So that's one way to go. Another way to go would be a simpler, a watch that doesn't say anything about you. I swim a lot. It's the only exercise I get. I don't like to do anything. But between the drinking and writing, I take a swim. So I love wearing a watch during the swim. So for that, one of my favorite watches is and one I really recommend for people just getting into watches, is the Tudor. Tudor is Rolex's younger sibling, but in some ways, I find them even more stylish or more inventive than Rolex sometimes. And certainly more affordable for people just starting out. So the Tudor Black Bay 36 or 41 are two really, really gorgeous watches that you can swim in. And Rolex, you can swim in any modern Rolex, right? Because it's a screw-down chrono.
Right.
So the Oyster Perpetual.
If you screw it down.
You have to screw it down. Yeah.
We do get two questions. Where is the battery?
Yeah.
You
Yes.
know, you just spent $30,000 and you know it doesn't have it. And yes, there's water in it. You're supposed to screw it down. So if you buy a nice watch, be sure it's screwed down.
Screw it down. Screw it down should be the motto of the Swiss watch industry.
So what do you think? Recently, Frederick Constant came out with a hybrid watch, which is half smart, half automatic. We see that in a lot of movies today, the marriage of technologies and humans or what have you. What do you see that as any future?
Well, I
for
think
anybody, or
it's
is
interesting. It's interesting that Frederick Constant does that, and a couple of other. I think there's a place out of Antwerp, Urwerk, I think, that does that as well. I don't mind it so much, but to me, you know, maybe I'm dumb enough to have bought into Patek Philippe's, you know, you don't own the watch, you're just keeping it for your bratty son. Maybe I bought into that a little bit, so I do think that this technology, such as it is, will be passed down to somebody at some point. And my kid is only 4, but he already loves watches. He can tell time already. But so, if you buy a watch that's a hybrid watch, or you know, you are banking for it to interface with technology, right? Like the iPhone. But in 10, 20, 30 years, will there be an iPhone? I assume things will be just implanted into our brain, right, at that point. So then what's the point of having a watch that's specifically designed to interface with a technology that itself is going to become obsolete? So maybe that's why I'm a purist.
That's a good point.
I'm a purist, just mechanical or bust.
So would it be appropriate if we asked if there are any questions, or do we have more time? How are we looking on time?
We have plenty of time.
Okay.
Shoot a few more questions if you want.
Okay, sure.
Get to the question.
Sure. You mentioned your motivation for it. What do you see some of the other motivations of people that are doing it? Is it the status? Is it the artistry of it? Is it the investment we see in some people?
Yeah, investment's a tough. If you buy watches and you expect a big return on investment, you got to really know what you're doing. And I know a couple of people I've met that have been doing it quite well. But I think for a lot of people, it's also, I'm scared of people. I usually have to pop at least a couple of Xanax to talk to anybody, or have a couple of martinis. But watches, in a weird way, it's something that people talk about. So when you go to a red bar, people interface because they'll say, "Oh my God, it's a micro rotor for the minutia of it and the nomenclature of it is something I really fell in love with." I have a friend from, and by the way, I started falling in love with watches during the election of 2016. And I think a part of me was just so freaked out by everything that was going on that I needed to find some small hobby to put myself into. And I have a good friend from Russia who grew up under socialism, spent most of his life under Putin, and he came to visit me in Manhattan a couple of years ago, and he collects these things. He collects shaving supplies. That's one thing he collects.
Okay.
So he says, we got to go to this badger, we got to find the badger whisk, And of course, Manhattan has a whole badger whisk district, badger whisk skyscraper, So we kept looking for these badger whisks, and I kept thinking, this guy is so weird that he's into badger whisks, But then, one election cycle later, I'm like, yeah, micro rotors. And I remember in the Soviet Union, where the system was so alienating and everything was a disaster, people clung to their hobbies with great fervor. I sometimes felt like every Soviet man or woman was a stamp collector, or a chess player, or a collector of weird jazz records. There was always something that people did because you kind of wanted to lose yourself in the minutia of some strange thing that had its own universe of terms, of terminology and lexicon, and I think that's what watches have done for me, is that they really relax me in a way. You read that piece where I was having a meltdown in a train that was stalled for hours underneath Manhattan, and looking at a watch, looking at the sweep hand of a watch, restored order in my mind. Made me feel that maybe there is a possibility of a future, because the watch was telling me that it was going to keep going and going and going. And eventually that future came hours later. The rescue train did not come, but the Polish woman was right, as Polish women usually are. Yes.
So now that you've gotten this passion, this love, how has it changed how you operate? Like, when you're walking around the room, are you like looking at people's watches that they've got? Are you peeking in their drawers when you go to their friends' houses, or
I'm surprised, people in Manhattan haven't punched me yet, because we're an angry bunch of people, and I'm always looking, yes, I am always trying to look at a person's watch, and it's important to know that your watch does not define who you are. You shouldn't judge people by their timepieces. So if you are wearing your Frederic Constant hybrid watch, there's nothing wrong with that. That's not who you are. You just happen to have made a bad decision. No, I'm kidding. You're great. Thank you for, yes. But no, I am very curious to do it. And I find that many people that I didn't realize are watch nerds too, and they're coming out of the woodwork, and writers too. I thought most of us were just busy, starving, but some of us have many watches too, and that's been. I won't mention any names because everyone's very private about this stuff, but you'd be surprised.
You do have the advantage that it is mobile, so in case you're a writer and have to leave on a minute's notice, or need a loan that day, you can always get out of the pawn shop.
Always go to the pawn shop. No, 1-800 U.S. Pawn.
So what's Mrs. Shteyngart think of all this? When she says she'd like to get something with a fourth bedroom, and you're like, no, I want to get a watch. What does she say? What's her feeling of this?
Ms. Wan, as Mrs. Shteyngart is called, she did not want Shteyngart to be her last name, and who would? She is is bemused and amused, but she has great taste. And so from the very beginning, every watch purchase I make, she really has better taste than I do. And I may know more of the mechanical side of it, what the movement is about, the provenance of it, the history of it, but she has said no to many, many, many watches. Not from a, you shouldn't be spending that money, although that makes sense as well, but simply, this is a very ugly watch, Gary, what are you doing? Put down that martini glass and take a long shower.
That's where the drinking intersects with the watch collecting in a not positive way.
A very funny blog actually talked about the importance of not buying a watch while drunk. And if that is one thing I can tell newbies is, yes, that's a very important part of it.
We could extend that philosophy to many other things, though, too. So, cars and what have you. So if we come back in 5 years or 10 years, I mean, in a way, from my point of view, it looks like we're in a renaissance of watchmaking and fine watchmaking, kind of like we've seen with craft beers or craft distilleries, or maybe some of the other things. We come back in 5 or 10 years. What do you think? Are you uncharacteristically hopeful, at least in this space, versus?
I think the watch industry, in particular the Swiss watch industry, goes through phases. And often the Swiss watch industry faces crises, and then they bounce back and do great stuff. So the big crisis in the past was the quartz crisis, when the Japanese and the Americans, Bulova and Seiko came out with these watches, and for a while it looked like the Swiss watch industry was dead. But they came out with better, both quartz and mechanical watches, so which led both to, the reinvention of a lot of Swiss watches, mechanical watches, and also the production of things like the Swatch watch, which became a great, hugely selling and brilliant idea. Lately, the Swiss watch industry, there have been a couple of things going at it. One is the fact that Germany has produced some really amazing watches lately. Nomos is one of the starter watches that before I switched to the Rolex brand. Nomos, Lange, I own one Lange, which is also a great watch. Grand Seiko is coming out with great watches. So I think all that inspires the Swiss to also up their game, because the competition makes everybody work harder to develop greater things. So, for example, I mentioned Tudor before, but also Jaeger LeCoultre, which is fun to say. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, but Jaeger LeCoultre, I'll say it again. Jaeger LeCoultre is a terrific brand. The sector dial watches they produce now are amazing. Rolex, I think, is doing great stuff. The ceramic bezels on their new watches are spectacular. So, and also the interesting thing about, I mentioned status symbols, right? In places like China, a watch is what you do to get ahead. You get a watch, it's used as a bribe, as a gift. In Russia, oh my God, everything is revolves around watches too. And the crackdown against graft in China, for example, really hit this watch and the Swiss and the German watch industry quite a bit, because it was this, all of a sudden the idea was you couldn't give it as a bribe. But still, the sales went down for a year or two, and I think then they recovered. And I think now they're really looking for the Western European and American consumers as the bulwark of their sales.
That's good. Well, if there is a question or two, perhaps, is that okay? If anybody has a question about their watch or the industry in general, or a question for Gary, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Before I throw it open, I was going to ask, it's been a while since you wrote a book. I read your last one, Little Failure. I think that was 4 years ago.
Yep.
So what's on tap for Gary?
Yeah.
What's next?
So like clockwork, I produce a book every 4 years. So this year there will be a book.
Okay.
It'll be out in September. It will be called Lake Success, because my last book was Little Failure. And the publisher was like, can we please put success? Because it actually hurts a book to have failure in the title. As we found out the hard way. No, people would be going by the airport and be like, oh, failure, that's not me. But success, oh crap, yeah. And Lake Success is about, the premise very quickly is about a hedge fund guy who loses his mind, gets on a Greyhound bus and goes across America, but he does it with 7 watches in his rollerboard. And so watches play, for all of you who like watches, watches play an integral role in the book. And one of the watches, a Universal Tri-Compax, actually becomes kind of a character in the book.
Okay.
So, yeah.
All right, so we'll be looking forward to that. We'll be looking forward. So if there's any questions, if anybody wants to ask Gary anything, this I think would be an opportunity. If there's any topics you want us to cover, or...
You've written a lot about your upbringing from your parents, growing up in Russia. Now that you're a parent, I'm just curious, are you kind of drawing upon your past? Are you doing things differently?
For those of you who read my memoir, yes, I'm doing things differently. No, but that's not fair. Look, my parents grew up in the Soviet Union. They did as well as they could, given the insanity of our circumstances. What am I doing differently? Well, we're growing up we're raising the kid in Manhattan. It's a different world than Leningrad 1972, to say the least. The difficult part of raising a kid in a place like Manhattan is that often wealth is mistaken for virtue, I would say, because it's such a wealthy place. That often you look at values and it's not anybody's fault at some point. It's just everything is about consumption and about, I'm saying this as I'm talking about my Rolex. But no, this is different. It's a hobby, I swear. But I think that's the hard part in some ways. And I often long for. We also spend half the year in the country, and while I don't know if I'd want my kid to go to school there, I do think that there are virtues there that don't exist in a place like Manhattan. But one thing my parents did well was that they focused on literature to a large extent. They said, we didn't have a television until I was, bar mitzvah age, right? There was no TV. And I think one thing we've been trying to do is limit access to screens as well. And if you read about Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, they don't want their kids playing with these things either.
Yeah.
So that's one thing we're trying to do. And of course, even as a 4-year-old, he's already typing. He knows how to type. He knows how to write, and so he's typing things to his babysitter. I love you. Stuff like that. But trying to limit that, and that's why watches are kind of cool with that way too. He already has one watch. His name is Johnny. I call it the Johnny watch, and he plays with it. So that's, I think, a sweet thing to do, is to limit access to technology.
You had mentioned when you emigrated here, you went to a tough yeshiva. That's somewhat of an oxymoron. Maybe you can explain that in more detail. What made it tough?
What made it tough? Well, what made it tough was, first of all, I was, kind of I didn't speak English or Hebrew, and I was also a bit of a nerd. All I wanted to do was read books, and there were a lot of tough kids. It may seem like an oxymoron, but in fact, remember that Casio watch that I mentioned? A bully came and took my watch away. My beloved watch, my only friend. And my grandmother, who really was tough, survived Stalin, Hitler, the whole 9 yards, came, tough balabusta, came to the principal and said, "We want watch! Give watch now!" And the principal's like, "All right." And so in typical watch geek fashion, the watch was taken away from the bully, passed on to my grandmother, and then given to me. But the way I kind of figured out, so I learned English after a while, and what I decided to do to create my own kind of stamp on the school was I wrote my own version of the Torah, called the Genora. Kids called me Gary Gnu, so I called it the Genora, and it was written on an actual scroll. And like Exodus became Sexodus. There was a whole parsha, a whole chapter devoted to Brooke Shields. It was very big at the time. So and humor and writing, satire basically is how I made my first friends in Hebrew school. My first American friends. I don't. No. A lot of Ativan has sanded away the edges. Nothing left. Yeah.
Have you gone over to Switzerland to do any researches on the Swiss watches?
No, but that is my next step. In fact, I was almost about to go to Basel World this year. Scheduling didn't happen, but I was about to go to Basel World this year. I think I will do some articles where I just want to. I've been to Switzerland a bunch of times, but usually just to present my books when they come out in German or French. And I've actually been to Basel, but not for watches, just to give a reading at the University of Basel. But I can't wait. I've actually ended up, because I was in Berlin, I ended up visiting the German analog, which is Glashütte, a town not far from Dresden, where German watches are made, Nomos and Lange. And that was fascinating. Just watching the watchmakers is, it's one of the, just, the way they work is so fascinating. They also have all these rules. They can't drink, for example. They recommended musical instruments and horseback riding are supposed to help watchmakers do their craft better, which I thought was fantastic. The non-drinking part was hard to stomach. God bless them, that's what they do. So I think very soon I want to visit a lot of the manufacturers. I definitely want to visit Rolex, Patek, maybe IWC that you were mentioning. So there's a lot of stuff I want to see. I can't wait. No. Who knew? I mean, I love other parts of Switzerland, the food and the cheese. I never knew I'd be coming for watches. Chocolates.
What are your thoughts collecting vintage versus new watches?
It's an interesting question. I love both, and I think my collection, such as it is at this point, is really balanced half and half. You know, when you, as a writer and a memoirist, I have many sentimental qualities. I love the idea of owning something that came from a long, long time ago. So the oldest watch I own is a Universal watch, Universal Tri-Compacts from 1945, from around, I think it was one of the first Tri-Compacts, which would put it around the time of the Yalta Conference or something, or certainly the Potsdam Conference, right? So it's a watch that has been around pretty much as long as my parents have been around. My mother was born in 1945. So it's been around for a very long time. It's such a beautiful watch, yellow gold. It wears well, the patina of its time. And when I look at it, I'm just fascinated that it's still around, still working and keeping time within 4 seconds. God, the craftsmanship that must have went into that in 1945. And this was not an expensive, it was an expensive watch, but it wasn't like a Patek Philippe. I think back then you could buy it for $200 in America, which granted was a lot more than it is today. But you know, if you were a middle-class person, you could theoretically own a watch like that. So when you look at vintage, you're able in one watch to encapsulate 70, 80 years of history. I also found out something very interesting for my parents. When my parents were dating, my mother, right before they got married, and they weren't about to get married, but my mother bought my father a very expensive Soviet watch, a Palyot watch. The Soviet watch industry was actually pretty interesting. They stole a lot of stuff from the Germans, so it worked pretty well. The technology in World War II. Palyot means flights. All these watches had names like Raketa, Palyot, Raketa is a rocket, Sturmansky, the navigator's watch. So she bought him a watch that cost 140 rubles, which was an engineer's salary at the time, because it was a Palyot watch, but it was meant for export, so meant for the West, or for Western tourists. And apparently my father was so impressed by that watch that very soon they got married. So in some ways...
And hence you.
So for me, the watch is practically an existential proposition, right? And I only found out about this very late because my mother saw me on Hodinkee, said, "Oh, I didn't know you like watches, really?" So she said, "You know, I have this watch." And so I have it. It's actually quite lovely. It's gold-plated, so the gold is flaking off. Something has to be done with that. Quality was not up to Swiss or German standards, obviously, but it's a lovely, lovely watch, and I want to get it repaired, and it's not working now, but I will do that soon, because it made me.
Are you the type of watch owner who buys to hold, and your intention is to own them the rest of your life, or will you sell them? As well as with 9 watches, how do you decide what to wear in the morning?
It's a good question. So far, no. I love these watches. I think they all suit a purpose. There's watches I wear for, you know, formal occasions, like the Patek Calatrava or the Lange Saxonia. There's watches I swim in, like the Tudor or the Nomos. There's watches for, there's one watch that really has a beautiful dial that reflects well in candlelight, so it's my romantic watch. There's a watch in travel, obviously a GMT watch like this one makes sense. So I do vary them quite a bit. I love wearing all of them. They all, and you know, and there's watches I often will go to a place that's a bit dangerous for research. I went to one place where I walked across a border and there were just bodies lying everywhere, and I thought, all right, I'm going to wear my Air King, the one that I bought for $1,500. Because it doesn't look like it's an expensive watch, you know. So there's definitely watches for different occasions. So far, I don't feel like the need to sell any of them. But a lot of the watch people I know, watch people I know, buy and sell all the time. They say you're not really a vintage collector until you've bought and sold 10 watches. So I'm not there yet.
Hi. When you mentioned with regard to the previous question, the watch that your mom gave your dad, in a way it made you, well, what also has probably made you was coming to the United States almost 40 years ago, but being here now. Do you think you could ever write as someone who has not come from the Soviet Union?
That's a good
like
question.
somebody who's plain white bread American, if I may say that?
Yeah. So my next novel, as I mentioned, Lake Success, is the first novel that doesn't have a Russian protagonist at all. The protagonist is Jewish, so you know, baby steps. But born in America, the novel is called Lake Success. Lake Success is a suburb of is near Great Neck, Long Island. I grew up in Little Neck, which is on the Queens side, the working class side, and I always pined for the Lake Success because it sounded so successful. But yes, an American character. The secondary character is a woman who is Indian American, whose parents are from India, but born in America. So sort of a daughter of immigrants, but not. There's maybe one Russian character pops up toward the end, very minor, but for the most part, it's my first. And you know, and I have a friend who's a Russian writer, and she said, "How did you do it? You escaped our ghetto," you know. And this is interesting. I teach a course at Columbia on immigrant fiction that I teach. Actually, I'm teaching it tomorrow, and it's very tough because when you get established for being one kind of writer, and a lot of readers associate me with writing about Russia, Russian Americans, so it's a little hard to branch out. But look, I've been here 38 years. You know, I should know this country by now. And also, I spend half the year now upstate, and there I feel really American. You know. So I drive my car. I just learned how to drive, not well, but you know, I drive it to. I love going to these giant things, Costco, not Costco, something, maybe Costco. I don't know. It's a big thing, and you walk in, and it was like, I love you, thank you for coming. Here's a schnitzel, you know, and I buy like giant things, like family size, it's called, of packs of everything. I walk out, and that made me feel so American. That's why I feel like I can really write about this country. And I squeeze it into the trunk. It's a good feeling.
In the back, we give you a chance now.
Sure. Did you get a chance to go to the Patek Philippe exhibit in New York?
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Yes. Yes, the Patek Philippe. I was actually leaving for India or something. I can't remember where I was going, but I quickly had the cab stop there and ran through it with my luggage. It was such a beautiful exhibit. Really interesting stuff. Joe DiMaggio had great taste in watches. Louis Armstrong, great taste in watches. Back then, if you were any kind of cultural figure, your taste in watches was exceptional. Just really great stuff. And of course, going back in history, looking at the 19th century stuff. I mean, you know, the history is amazing. You got to, you know, without timekeeping, no other technology would really have been possible. And timekeeping even predates the Swiss. Obviously, the Mesopotamians and Indians and people all over the world were developing all kinds of technology. In China, the technology was being developed. But you know, the way it was made into real art. Through 17th, 18th, 19th century, not just the Swiss, the British also were doing incredible. Many people collect pocket watches, by the way. That's sort of they're the unsung heroes of this stuff. But before wristwatches became a thing, pocket watch collecting was very much a thing, and they're absolutely gorgeous. I would have to buy a vest or something and get really steampunk there.
Put on a few pounds too.
Put a few pounds on, because you need a belly to kind of buttress the thing. But they're absolutely gorgeous, and a lot of the people I love, like Jack Forster, the writer at Hodinkee, has a brilliant collection of pocket watches.
Okay, we'll take one last question because, to tell you the truth, it's really hot in the back, so we'll be able to.
Hot up here too.
Hi. Do you ever see Russian Debutant's Handbook being adapted to the screen, or that book being revisited in some way?
Many of my books have been bought for TV, and then nothing's ever happened with them, although we keep developing them. Russian Deb was bought by a film company for a while, and nothing ever happened with that. Often now I'm getting a lot of requests for some of the books to be turned into plays. One in London, actually. So that's something I want to pursue. Yeah, I'd love to see all this stuff be made into a series. And I love writing screenplays too. It's so much fun. That is, compared to writing novels, oh my God, you could do it like that. So yeah, hopefully one of these things will come to fruition.
Well, as I said, it's getting really hot in the back. I'm sorry, I didn't realize that all the heat is going up there. I want to thank Mitch. I want to thank Gary. I want to thank everybody who made this program possible. I want to thank all of you for coming. We can keep talking outside. We are selling Gary's book. Come and buy a book. He will sign it for you because he's such a gentleman. And let's go have a drink. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, it's a pleasure.
Pleasure to meet you.
Yeah. No, we're a team.